Information from Gaza is increasingly hard to come by. Israel periodically cuts the internet connection in the Strip. Israel's airstrikes keep killing Palestinian journalists on the ground, and international journalists haven't been allowed by Israel to enter Gaza. That is, unless those journalists let Israel control exactly what they say. This clip is from CNN.
Gaza. Yesterday, CNN's Jeremy Diamond went into Gaza on an IDF embed. I should note that journalists embedded with the IDF in Gaza operate under the observation of Israeli commanders in the field and are not permitted to move unaccompanied within the Gaza Strip. As a condition to enter Gaza under IDF escort, outlets have to submit all materials and footage to the Israeli military for review prior to publication. CNN has agreed to these terms in order to provide a limited window into Israel's operations in Gaza.
So the host, Fareed Zakaria, said there, as a condition to enter Gaza under IDF air support, outlets have to submit all materials and footage to the Israeli military for review prior to publication. CNN has agreed to these terms. Now, it just so happens that Zakaria is actually one of the better TV journalists in the US. And you can say, to his credit, at least he's admitting that they're doing embedded journalism, which is not going to tell us the truth. But you have to ask, why do it in the first place, right? If you can't be critical about the key protagonist in the war because you have to show them all your footage, how are you not just doing propaganda? It's also very, very grim when you consider what independent journalists in Gaza are experiencing. And the message basically is to journalists here, either you let Israel tell you what you can say, or you get killed. 36 journalists have already been killed in Gaza. One of them was Mohammed Abu Hattab, who was killed along with 11 members of his family members in Khan Yunis. Here's how his colleagues reported that dreadful news.
نحتمل لقد أنهكنا إننا هنا ضحايا شهداء مع فرق التوقيت فقط نحن نمضي واحدا تلو الآخر ولا أحد ينظر إلينا ولا إلى حجم الكارثة والجريمة التي نعيشها في غزة. لا حماية دولية على الإطلاق ولا حصانة لأي شيء. لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا تحمينا هذه القبعات. إنها مجرد شعارات نرتديها فقط. هي لا تحمي أي صحفي على الإطلاق لا تحمينا هذه الدروع ولا هذه ما نرتديها فقط. هي شعارات فقط. نحن هنا ضحايا على الهواء مباشرة نفقد الأرواح واحدا تلو الآخر بلا أي ثمن. نمضي شهداء فقط مع فرق التوقيت. نحن ننتظر الدور واحدا تلو الآخر. زميلنا محمد أبو حطب كان هنا منذ نصف ساعة فقط وغادرنا الآن هو وزوجته وابنه وأخيه وكثير من عائلته هم ضحايا هنا في داخل المستشفى.
Other journalists have continued working despite having their families wiped out. Al Jazeera's Gaza bureau chief, Wael Dadua, lost his wife, son, daughter, and other relatives to an Israeli airstrike. He found out about their deaths when they were brought into a hospital he was reporting from. 24 hours later, he was back reporting for Al Jazeera.
السلام عليكم. أولا شكرا على كل رسائل التضامن والاتصالات والسؤال عنا والتضامن معنا والدعوات لنا. بالتأكيد هذا شيء كان مهما بالنسبة لنا، لكن رأينا أنه من الواجب أن نعود سريعا رغم كل شيء. فالساحة والمحاور ما زالت تشتعل كما ترون بالغارات وبالقصف المدفعي والتطورات متلاحقة. فرأيت أن من واجبي رغم الوجع ورغم الجرح النازف أن أعود سريعا وألتقيكم من خلال عدسة الكاميرا عبر مواقع التواصل. يعطيكم العافية وأسألكم الدعاء دائما وأبدا. السلام عليكم.
That is much braver than being a journalist embedded with the IDF. Novara Media also has this report on journalists working in Gaza. Daisy Schofield spoke to some who told her they believe journalists are being deliberately targeted by the IDF. A photojournalist called Mohammed Alalul told her this. Journalistic work is very dangerous as the Israeli occupation targets journalists everywhere. There is no protection for Palestinian journalists. Now, that article was published on Friday. 2 days later, Daisy Schofield tweeted this. The Palestinian journalist Mohammed Al-Alul, who I spoke to for this Novara Media article, lost 4 of his children in an Israeli airstrike on Sunday, beyond devastating news. Now, I just think that really sort of speaks to the tempo of this war. You know, everyone who is commenting on this war, who has friends and family in Gaza, every night they don't know if they're about to be killed. You have someone who's interviewed on Saturday and they die on Sunday, interviewed on Friday, their family are all dead by Monday, right? The extent of death and suffering and loss in Gaza is to such an extreme degree right now that anyone we hear from in Gaza, there seems to be a pretty large chance they're not going to make it 2 more weeks, right? And then to have a government saying this is targeted bombing. Well, if it's targeted, you're clearly targeting journalists, right? So what's worse? It's indiscriminate or you're targeting journalists. It's one of those two things. Helena, what do you make of this contrast between, I suppose, CNN putting its embedded journalists under the protection of the IDF and then letting the IDF control what they say, or at least control what they can and can't say, so they'll be able to veto stuff, and then the independent Gazan journalists who are risking their lives every day and their families' lives every day?
I mean, I think what we learned from the Ukraine conflict was that we are truly now in the information age war, where with the free flow of information, given how places like, for example, news networks can have their clips on social media go viral instantly, gaining control over the narrative is incredibly important if you're a powerful state doing something that is in no way defensible. Right? We saw this in the way that, although Putin as an enemy of the West would use his kind of non-linear narrative, the kind of Vladislav Surkov style, engaging in information war to try and confuse people as to the reality of the conflict in Ukraine. Because Israel is an ally of the West, they need to ensure that the information that is being consumed fits the narrative, a narrative in which everything that they are doing is justified but regrettable, rather than indeed completely unjustifiable and morally bereft. And so what we have to do to control that narrative, first of all, is to control the official narrative coming out from officially established news organizations, places like CNN, to ensure that every information that they put out to their own viewer base within the West, who is, of course, where their material support comes from, as we described earlier on today, because any amount of changing of that narrative could undermine public support for continued military and financial support to the state of Israel in its essentially war of ethnic cleansing that we're seeing at the moment. So that's what they will do with the official narrative coming out of places like CNN, etc. When it comes to journalists on the ground in Gaza, they are giving us the very first-hand reporting of the absolute devastation that's being wrought by the Israeli military and what is engaging in, essentially, as I mentioned before, a campaign of ethnic cleansing, which you wouldn't see. None of us would be seeing this stuff were it not being reported on by Gazan journalists on the ground, risking their lives so we can see their plight and what they are facing at the hands of the Israeli military. And if these clips, because we're seeing this footage that we're seeing on the ground in Gaza, makes it to Western audiences, it doesn't matter how much control that Israel have over the official narrative. There is a level of human empathy that a lot of us can feel and can show with what is essentially devastation on the ground in Gaza at the moment. Right? It's difficult to view this footage and not feel an innate connection to the people and to feel sympathy for the people who are having their lives completely uprooted and sometimes ended by a brutal military campaign that we're seeing at the moment. So targeting these journalists to stop this footage coming out is something that even if you thought you were doing something entirely morally justified, right, you know that your ability to do that is could be entirely curtailed by a change of political allegiance from the West. So they're targeting journalists, in my mind, deliberately to ensure that people in the West have an incredibly sanitized view of what they're seeing from the conflict. I think a lot of people in the West who've given kind of de facto support for Israel for a very, very long time have done so out of ignorance, out of not seeing the reality of Palestinian lives, right? We remember the Ta-Nehisi Coates bit from the other day talking about, well, I just went to the West Bank and saw the situation then. How could I not empathize with Palestine? And so there's for many people, it's their first time seeing this reality, and it's changing people's minds. We're seeing minds changed all the time. I was actually watching a debate between you and Kelvin McKenzie earlier, Michael, and there was a point at which you said to him that the history of Netanyahu was him bolstering Hamas. And he didn't believe you. He thought you were lying. He thought you were just making things up. And that's because the narrative has been entirely sanitized and sterilized to ensure continued Western support for what Israel is doing. And any amount of on-the-ground journalism from Palestinians completely undermines that and their ability to continue this information war. And it is telling the kind of people that they target and have always targeted. They targeted journalists during the Great March of Return as well. And it is very damaging. But at the end of the day, sometimes that is the unfortunate truth of what war looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I take that. I mean, I think that was all very well put. I suppose the one bit I think we should be careful with is that this is the unfortunate, obviously all war is horrible. All war is horrible. But I do think that Israel are trying to say, all the civilians dying, all the journalists dying, this is just war. If you can either support everything we're doing or you can oppose war in general. We're not pacifists. Sure, we can kill 36 journalists. What do you think war looks like? And I do think we need to be clear that the toll this conflict is taking on journalists is not normal. It is not just the inevitable cost of war. Jodie Ginsberg is president of the Committee to Protect Journalists. She said this to the BBC.
The level of danger for journalists operating in Gaza right now is absolutely unprecedented. This is the most dangerous conflict for journalists that the Committee to Protect Journalists has ever documented. And we've been recording and documenting attacks against journalists for more than 30 years. 36 journalists have been killed in the past 4 weeks. And to put that in kind of context for you, last year we documented 68 journalists and media workers killed worldwide over the space of 12 months, and 36 have died just in 4 weeks, just in Israel and Gaza.
So she said this is the most dangerous conflict for journalists that the Committee to Protect Journalists has ever documented, and that organisation has been around for 30 years. So in 30 years, they have never seen a conflict which puts so many journalists in such danger. Right, and you think, last year maybe there weren't so many wars going on, and that's why 68 journalists were killed over a whole year, whereas 36 have been killed in 4 weeks. There was a war in Ukraine, right? Russia invaded Ukraine. There are lots of wars going on, but it's in this war that so many journalists are getting killed. And you have to ask, either that's because Israel is targeting journalists like no other country has done, or this is a more indiscriminate form of bombing than we've seen anywhere else in recent history. That does make sense. I mean, you've got 2.5 million people in this very small bit of land, and Israel is just bombing buildings left, right, and center. So it's just appalling. And as I say, this is a situation where you've still got Western governments making excuses for Israel, not just making excuses for Israel, sending them military aid, right? Sending them military aid as they kill more journalists in 4 weeks than were killed in 6 months last year.